Any board needs to use data as part of its governance role. But what is governance? In its simplest form, there are three elements to it. The first one is establishing the standard. Now, the standard or the targets may come from the government, or it could come from the annual operating plan. Once you've set these, the next stage is to monitor against these standards, and that's where the data comes in. And all the charts and everything are so that we can monitor the system. And then finally, the third step is to have some sort of methodology to allow you to close gaps in performance so that you are actually meeting the standard. Any organisation will tend to present their data through rose-tinted spectacles. Let's be kind. They're trying to make the organisation look as good as possible, and therefore the data is presented exactly in that fashion. However, in performing the governance role as part of the board, you need to be drilling down beyond that. And the key question is asking what's happening in the system. And maybe the data that's being presented, or simply the way that it's presented, needs to change to allow you to see that whole system view. It is absolutely critical that you look at the variation in the system before you consider assurance. So what does this mean? You need to know whether your system has changed, is exhibiting any signals for special cause prior to looking at the targets. And I guess this is the key point within this whole training, is that you need to look at variation first and then assurance. So how will you know if your system has changed? What information can you take from the board papers that are going to help you with this? Is it the narrative or the text within the papers? Probably not. Is it tables of numbers? Well, it's actually very difficult to detect change unless it's extremely obvious just from a list of numbers. What about red, amber, green status? Well, we'll talk in a different part of the training how they're really good for the assurance part, but they don't help you assess the variation, and it's critical you do that first. So we're looking at run charts, or line charts as they're often called, or preferably control charts in order to detect change. Sometimes the change is so obvious that a simple line chart will show it up. I love this example. It comes from the US, the weekly unemployment figures, and you can see a small bump around the financial crash in 2008, but then a massive spike at the beginning of the COVID crisis. This process has obviously changed, and we can tell that from this simple line chart. And we need to act appropriately because we know the system has changed. In most cases, it's difficult to determine system change using a simple line chart, and we need to revert to the control chart, which is the single best way of detecting change. So, what is a control chart? It's simply the data plotted in relation to time, and then we add limits, given as red lines in this particular example, upper and lower control limits. And we know that if any point lies outside the limits, then that's a strong signal that something has changed. It's what we call a special cause. And therefore, we can act appropriately because we know it's worthwhile going to look and find out what caused that change. In this particular example, there is no point outside the limits. So this is only common cause variation. This process or system is stable and predictable. So what's happening now, we can predict will happen in the short to medium term. However, in this case, this control chart shows 2 points outside the limits. One outside the lower control limit and one outside the upper control limit. And it's worthwhile going to investigate what happened. What caused these changes? because this is a strong signal that something has changed within your system that we can learn from and use that to make improvements. So here are a few useful questions to ask as part of your governance role. And the first question, and probably the most important, can you present that data in a control chart? Because that's the single best way of detecting system change. Secondly, can we see the data as the raw data, not percentages or ratios? Let's see it from the patient's point of view. Why can't we just count the number of patients as an example? Then if the process has changed, a great question is, do you know why? And I would expect this answer to be backed up by data and not the general arm waving, oh, well, it's because of this and it's maybe that and it's maybe the next thing. And then finally, if the performance has changed, a lovely question is, have you set up a project team to go and investigate that in more detail? So these are just a few of the questions that you can ask as part of your governance role. But remember that data is absolutely critical to governance.